Good evening, everyone. Hi, Larry. Hi, John. Hi, Art. Hi, Nancy. Hi, all of our great regulars here at the Heartland Institute. Super. Thanks for that. And thank you all for being here tonight. Thank God for global warming, at least for another couple days. It's going to go back to being winter soon, but I hope you're all enjoying the outside. We even had to put on the AC tonight to make sure we're all sweating in here. I'd like to welcome everyone here to the Andrew Breitbart Freedom Center. My name is Jim Lakely, for some of the new people that are here. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. And Heartland was founded in 1984 in Chicago by a group of individuals led by our founder, Dave Padden, who met regularly to discuss the value of free markets and individual liberty, and the need to promote those ideas to the general public, not in Washington, D.C. or California, where our guest is from tonight, but from right here in the Heartland, which is where we get our name. Our mission since that founding has been to discover, develop, and promote free market solutions to social and economic problems, to fight for the policies that shrink the scope and the power of government, and increase individual liberty, including our free speech rights, which is why we're all very excited about the guests we have for you tonight. If you like what you see tonight, either watching online or here with us in person, I encourage you to look around at heartland.org, where you're going to learn a lot more about the great things that we do. You can check out our blog, Freedom Pub. We have some of our authors at the Freedom Pub here tonight, and it's a great updated every day on the news of the day and some very interesting things. You can check out Heartland's podcast, free podcast, the Heartland Daily Podcast on iTunes. 1.3 million people downloaded and listened to that over the last 12 months, and we can expect to grow even more. And in fact, I had a podcast that will be published later this week with our guest tonight. You can check out our YouTube page where this event is being live streamed and automatically archived. So if you've missed anything that the Heartland Institute does, you'll be able to watch it all at your leisure, either on your smart TV or on your computer or on your mobile device. And I hope also you've had a chance to check out the Michael Perry Mazur Memorial Library, which we have here, where it's up to 14,000 volumes of books, research that you can use for research on free markets and individual liberty. We really do believe, and we hope someone, and we're daring someone to call me a liar on this one, but we think it really is the best library for free markets and liberty anywhere in the Midwest. And we encourage you, after the event tonight, to take a stroll through there and see if there's a thing there to your liking, and to encourage other people to come and visit our library as well. And if you have books to donate to our library, we'd be happy to take them. You can talk to any Heartland staffer, and we can get you involved in adding to that great library of liberty. And of course, if advancing freedom is important to you, and if you're here and you're watching, it probably is, I hope that you will consider joining the Heartland Institute. We are able to put on events like this and to live stream things and to keep everything moving toward liberty from here at Heartland because of the support of our donors and our friends. And so if you are a donor to the Heartland Institute today, we thank you and hope you can give some more. And if you're not a donor to the Heartland Institute, please talk to someone about being one, or even just dropping a check in the boxes on the tables. There are benefits that come to being a member of the Heartland Institute beyond the psychic good feeling that you will have knowing that you're supporting the cause of liberty. And so we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. And if you, while it's still warm out, it's still t-shirt weather, I think, for another 36 hours, you can get a great Freedom t-shirt that we have here. They're only $10. If you're a fan of Friedman or Hayek or Martin Luther King or Ayn Rand, hint, hint, about our guest tonight, we have shirts of her as well. And they'll make great conversation starters at the gym or walking around your neighborhood. So we hope you consider getting that as well. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Steve Simpson, who will be talking about his book called Defending Free Speech. Now, could this book be any more timely right now? Attacks on free speech have never been more frequent, it seems, or violent, and shamefully excused and defended by so-called liberals in the West mainstream media and our culture. Alinskyite tactics now seem to be the norm. Riots are not uncommon, and for years, before our current national and dangerous temper tantrum that's been having since, I don't know, around November 9th. Any non-leftist speaker invited to a campus these days is routinely subject to threats, being shouted down, or even physical attacks. There's a reason why Ann Coulter, when she speaks on campuses, requires guards, and that, I don't know, Rachel Maddow does not. And our speaker tonight, I'm sure, will speak to that in a certain respect. And sometimes, of course, exercising the right to speak one's mind in public can be deadly. The fatwa on Salman Rushdie for writing the Satanic Verses was 28 years ago and still stands. A Danish newspaper dared to publish cartoons of Muhammad in 2005, and it sparked violence around the world. And of course, many of you remember the slaughter at Charlie Hebdo's offices in Paris, France. That seems like so long ago. It was 25 months ago. And it seems so long ago because maybe these things are becoming too common, and we need to put a stop to that. Tonight's guest, Steve Simpson, will speak about the imperative of the West not wavering in its devotion to protecting and promoting free speech. He is the Director of Legal Studies at the Ayn Rand Institute, based in Irvine, California. He's a former senior attorney at the Institute for Justice, where he has litigated constitutional cases at the U.S. Supreme Court and state and federal courts throughout the nation on a wide variety of issues, but all of them fighting for the rights of the individual that are put at risk by the actions of the state. His new book, again, is Defending Free Speech. If you do not have it yet, I hope you get it on your way out and get it signed by him. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Steve Simpson.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Jim, and thanks to Heartland for having me here. Let me just set my water down here to give a talk on this all-important subject. Jim mentioned a couple of the incidents that form kind of the backdrop for my talk and the reason to protect free speech these days. To put it bluntly, free speech is under attack. And let me start just with a really short anecdote. Jim reminded me of this when he was talking about Ann Coulter and the fact that when she goes to speak on college campuses, she often needs armed guards. So I gave a series of, or I participated, I was very fortunate over the last month or so to participate in a handful of panel discussions with a guy by the name of Fleming Rose. I don't know how many people have heard the name Fleming Rose. I hope you have. He's the editor of the Danish newspaper that published the Muhammad cartoons in 2006. And one of the things I said, these are on college campuses, and I pointed out at both of these events, I said to the students in the audience, because these are young kids, they don't have the same frame of reference that I do, certainly, and I think that many of you do. And I said, look over there, the guy standing there with the gun on his hip and the flak jacket. We have an armed guard here, and all of you had to pass through a metal detector in order to get into a talk about freedom of speech. Okay, there is something really wrong going on in America if that has to be the context in which we discuss free speech. So with that, let me launch into the talk. So as I said, free speech is under attack in the Western world, I think, in general. Now, when I say under attack, it's certainly under attack in physical ways in certain senses. I mean, there are attacks by radical Islamists. I typically refer to them as Islamic totalitarians because there's a whole ideology behind them, and they're trying to impose a whole political system on the rest of the world. And those are obviously horrifying. We've seen riots on campus, and I'll talk a lot about these incidents. But I really think what's scary and what is really troubling from a long-term standpoint isn't just those attacks. It's how we think about those attacks. It's the attitude toward freedom of speech, or you might put it as the ideas that undergird freedom of speech and how people regard freedom of speech today. So I think the real fight today about freedom of speech is an intellectual battle. If we think about the Supreme Court, I don't know how many people follow the Supreme Court. I was a lawyer, as Jim said, for many, many years, and I defended free speech in court. The Roberts Court, the court under John Roberts, is probably one of the best courts for freedom of speech that we've seen in many, many decades. So I can just sum up the point by saying, as a matter of law, freedom of speech is very well protected now, as it stands, right now, okay? Now, what will happen in the future is anyone's guess, but if we look to college campuses, just to take one example, and remind ourselves of the cliche that children are our future, right? And we look to how free speech is regarded on campus, it's really chilling. And that is the battle that we have to have. If we want to preserve this all-important right, we've got to fight for the ideals on which it's based. And that's really what I want to focus on in my remarks. And I'll focus on a number of the incidents that, that we've seen over time and try to bring out some of the ideas that, that are motivating the attacks on free speech and then what we have to do to defend it. Let me start by reminding you all of something that I think goes unnoticed today, and I think this is a real bad trend and something that was not always the case even in my life. I'm only 50 years old, 52 years old, and things have changed radically even in the time that I've been practicing law and doing what I do. And what I want to remind you of is freedom of speech is a right. It's a right. Okay? It is an inviolable individual right. And what that means is, to oversimplify the point just a little bit, it means you have the right to say pretty much any damn thing you want so long as you don't violate the rights of other people, okay? And there are ways that one can violate the rights of others through using their speech incident to a crime, fraud, incitement, threats, etc. I can elaborate on that in the question and answer period, but they're fairly narrow. They're not exceptions, they're actually applications of the right, because a right properly understood is not a right to violate the rights of others. One must respect the rights of others. But I think we too often regard in this country, and probably not the people in this room, but the people, I'm sure you've run across this, it's that free speech is really more of a privilege. It's something that we get to exercise at the sufferance of society or the government. It's no longer the idea, you've heard this saying, which has been reflected in Supreme Court opinions, that freedom of speech means freedom for the idea we hate. Today it's more like, well, freedom of speech means freedom for the ideas that aren't going to offend too many people. And that's really wrong. And we need to think about this as a right that is not only important for the maintenance of a free society, but a right that is in the interests and to the benefit of every single member of society. And that's kind of what I want to get to. Now, what I said earlier that I think this is a battle of ideas. So let me give you what I think are the foundational ideas that undergird and are necessary for the right to free speech. And you probably won't be surprised to learn that these are very much ideas of the Enlightenment and ideas of the American founding. Okay, so one of them is reason. I was talking to Jim earlier on his podcast, and I pointed out that it's not a mistake that the Age of Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the industrial revolution all go hand in hand, because the Enlightenment represents the rediscovery of reason. And free speech is only necessary and important if we actually take the idea that we are reasoning beings seriously, and that we have something intelligent to say to one another, that we have a reason to figure out how the world works, and a reason to communicate that to people. The second idea is captured in the Declaration of Independence, a statement that individuals have the right to pursue their own happiness. I'm from the Ayn Rand Institute, so I'll put it in the terms that Ayn Rand would have put it. This is egoism. This is the idea that your life serves your own happiness. You're an end in yourself. You're an individual, and you have the right to pursue your own happiness, which means you have the right to speak your mind and pursue your own values. The final idea is the idea politically of individualism. Okay, we are all, again, individuals with individual rights. Again, read the Declaration of Independence, okay? Individuals have certain rights, and we institute or create government to protect those rights. That's the idea of individualism. We are all individuals. We have the individual right to speak our minds, to communicate with others, to the betterment of our life, or to blabber on nonsensically if we want, so long as we don't violate the rights of others. And the fact that other people can be offended by that is really too bad for them. Be offended. If you don't like it, walk away. That's what the right to free speech means. Now, I think that these ideas are under attack. In fact, I think the entire Enlightenment project that spawns the modern world and certainly gives rise to the founding of America is under attack, and we can really see this happening, especially on college campuses. And the three ideas that run counter to the ideas that I just talked about that undergird the attacks on free speech are, I'd capture them as irrationalism, the idea that reason is kind of pointless, and once you throw reason out the window, what's the point of communicating? The idea of altruism or self-sacrifice, our obligation in life is to sacrifice ourselves to, and then just fill in the blank. It can be anybody, and typically these days, if you think about the idea of multiculturalism, it's every culture except American culture or Western culture. And I'll give a few examples to flesh that out. And finally, the idea of collectivism, the idea that we're not really individuals, we're members of groups, and our obligation, not just socially, but legally and politically, is to do what the group demands of us. Again, you can see this manifesting it in the idea of multiculturalism. We divide ourselves into little tribes, and then the tribes decide what we can say and what we ought to think. So those are the ideas that I think are attacking the right to free speech today. So let me go through a few examples, and then I'll give you some concluding remarks on how I think we need to defend free speech, and then we can open it up for questions. So I want to start with the example of college campuses. I want to use one example in particular because it's the most recent example. And as Jim said, I mean, there's so much happening in this area. And as I wrote the book a year ago, and it already seems like everything that I talked about in the book, terrorist attacks, other things that have been going on, is already dated because we've had a slew of renewed attacks on this precious right. The most recent one being, I think you've probably all heard about this, is the riots at Berkeley. And I think it's worth dwelling on that for a moment because it wasn't just the riots that were that represented a real attack on free speech. It's what happened in the aftermath of the riots, and I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about what some of the students said because they really capture the attitude toward free speech on campuses these days, and it's very chilling. But you recall that Milo Yiannopoulos was scheduled to speak at Berkeley. There was a riot, essentially a riot. I think people will call this a protest. If you want to call it a protest, you ought to call it a violent protest, which kind of obviates the need to talk about it as a protest. It was a riot. They lit the campus on fire and then roamed through the town and broke, of all things, bank windows. Why it is that opposing Milo Yiannopoulos requires people to go break the windows of banks is anyone's guess. Well, actually, I could elaborate on that, but I think that tells you something about the nature of the protesters. But again, as I said a moment ago, it's not necessarily the incidents itself that are troubling. What is troubling is the aftermath of the incidents and how people react to it. Now notice that, yes, there was a little bit of press about these. There wasn't anywhere near the widespread criticism there should have been. And not only that, in the Daily Californian, which is the college newspaper on Berkeley's campus, there was a series of articles written that essentially justified violence in response to speech that's very offensive. Now, I have no truck with, or I'm not a fan of Milo Yiannopoulos. I think he's more or less a clown. He's a provocateur. I don't really think much of his ideas, such as they are. I don't think he really has many ideas, but it doesn't ultimately matter. He was there by right. He was invited by the college Republicans. They had a right to invite him. Berkeley had a right to have the talk, and it was shut down by people rioting, which is a clear violation of one's free speech. In fact, I think it's an example of really anarchy if we allow that to happen. And yet there was not really much in the way of condemnation of this. And as I said, there was this series of articles that was written. And I want to give you a flavor of what these articles conveyed because these are really the ideas that I spoke about before in action. And if we don't put a stop to this, if we don't mount a real courageous defense of freedom of speech, we will lose it because this is what college students think today. And this is where the motivations for these attacks is coming from. So the title of this issue was Violence as Self-Defense, okay? An entire issue of the Daily Californian devoted to the idea that the riots were justified as a matter of self-defense. Self-defense against what exactly, you might ask? And the answer is offensive speech. Let me just give you a flavor of a few of these articles. One of them was titled, Check Your Privilege When Speaking of Protests, okay? And the idea was that those who were criticizing the protests were, essentially it was stated as privileged white people who don't understand the lot or the situation of, quote, marginalized groups. Marginalized students or groups, mind you, that attend one of the most prestigious colleges in the entire world, but leaving that aside for a moment. Let me read you just a few key quotes from this because it gives you a real sense of what students actually believe today. So here's a quote, marginalized student communities have been extremely vocal about the quote, violent impact of Yiannopoulos. Violent impact, okay? He was there to speak. Remember that. He was speaking. He was not engaging in violence. They go on to talk about the fact that he was planning to out various people. I think it was point to immigrants that were there allegedly illegally. And then it goes on to say and this outing of people, quote, places our classmates in an even greater risk of being attacked. This is violence. If I know that you're planning to attack me, I'll do all I can to throw the first punch. Violence. This is coloring speech as violence. It's saying that what Yiannopoulos was doing, bad as it is, I think, I mean, again, I don't really think he has many ideas to speak of, but we can imagine all kinds of people with really horrible ideas up there. But still, there's a distinction to be drawn, and we have to distinguish between speech and violence. Now, I could continue to quote from more and more of these essays, but they all echoed the same idea. Yiannopoulos was there to, quote, attack us or to use violence against us. He was a threat to our safety. We called for the administration to oppose him. Nobody listened to us, so we had no choice but to riot, okay? Now, if you think about that, that's really wacky. I mean, that's a crazy idea. Number one, equating speech with violence, right, which is just flatly false. It's not true that speech is the same thing as violence. It's not true that speech is the same thing as force. And number two, the idea that, well, we argued that the administration shouldn't allow Yiannopoulos to speak, and they didn't listen to us, so the only thing open to us was to riot, which again is a crazy idea. What are you talking about? How about don't attend the talk? How about convince other people not to attend the talk? How about mounting a demonstration in which you argue against these ideas? But none of this was something that these students thought of, and I can tell you, having looked into this issue and been on college campuses, there are a lot of college students, and I could give you many, many examples of this, who actually have accepted this idea that speech is violence, that speech is a form of force, which is a scary notion. And if you accept it and you take it seriously, then it actually makes sense. If you really think that somebody is threatening you, okay, if you really think that somebody is about to attack you, self-defense does make sense. I mean, we have a right to self-defense. So if I really take seriously the idea that speech is a threat or speech is a form of violence, then there's a logic there. It does make sense to riot. It does make sense to try to shut people down, or at least to advocate that they be shut down, at the very least to advocate that the government shut them down. So if we take these ideas seriously, there's a logic to how people behave when they accept these ideas. So we ought to really take a look at and see where these ideas come from. Let me capture the point in a different way, and on this I want to quote Ayn Rand, who I think spoke eloquently to this topic. And here's the quote. Quote, quote, there are only two means by which men can deal with one another, guns or logic, force or persuasion. Those who know they cannot win by means of logic have always resorted to guns. Okay, that's a very important and I think insightful comment. Because what you often see behind a lot of the protest against free speech as such is people who want to defend ideas that they really can't defend and that they therefore turn to violence. And once you throw logic, reason out the window, once you throw persuasion out the window, the only thing you're left with is force. And that's why I pointed earlier to this is an attack on reason. So where do these ideas come from? Well, let me just give you a flavor of that. There are a number of thinkers that through history that have influenced what is taught on college campuses today. Most notably the postmodernists, although there are many other thinkers that I can go into in the Q&A if people are interested. But there's a very strong strain of teaching in the humanities today that teaches essentially that reason is nonsense, that the idea that we can think and that we can solve our problems and that we can talk to one another and that we can communicate and use logic and reason as opposed to force is crazy. It's a nutty idea. So a lot of the postmodernists talk about the idea that reason is just nonsense. It's a made-up concept, or reason and power are essentially the same thing. Reason and force there's not really a distinction between these two things. There's a famous postmodernist by the name of Stanley Fish, who used to teach at Duke, who wrote a book of essays called There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too. And his basic argument was speech, reason, persuasion, it's all an illusion. It's all really just a means of oppressing or asserting ourselves or dominating other people. He referred to free speech as a kind of political weapon. And if you're lucky enough to be able to define the terms, you get to use this political weapon against other people. Now, there's many more thinkers that I could point you to that believe essentially the same thing. And you can see this reflected in the comments that I just read. This idea that, look, if Yiannopoulos is going to say something that offends me, that's tantamount to using force against me. It's tantamount to oppressing me. It's tantamount to dominating me. And what choice do I have but to fight back? So I think that's a really good example of this, what I referred to earlier as an attack on reason. All right, let me move on. I'm going to take one more example and then summarize, because I see that I'm already running out of time. I tend to talk a lot as a lawyer, but I want to focus on the Exxon investigation, because I think that's near and dear to many people's hearts here, and give this as an example of how a kind of collectivized or tribalized view of society, collectivism, which I referred to before, is impacting the law. Because I think the Exxon investigation is a good example of that, and it's one of the really most dangerous attacks on free speech that I've seen in my entire career. Now, you're no doubt aware of the Exxon investigation. This is the New York Attorney General and the Massachusetts Attorney General investigating Exxon for allegedly lying about climate change or about global warming. And the argument is that Exxon long ago did research into this. They've known for a long time about the, quote, risks of global warming. And I don't have a particular view of whether global warming is happening or not, although I will say that given the weather in Chicago right now, I'm a big fan of it if it is happening. But that's a kind of a lighthearted way of pointing out that there's much to debate about this, not just the science of global warming, whether it's beneficial, whether it's a bad thing, whether it's going to happen at all, whom it will affect over the long term. And of course, Exxon being, I think, frankly, a good corporate citizen, back in the 1970s, did research into the impacts of fossil fuels on climate. And if you read these, I've actually read a lot of these reports, and they strike me as, a scientific debate. On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. On the one hand, maybe it'll be bad. On the other hand, maybe it won't be bad. Temperature could rise anywhere and have an impact on the climate, or fossil fuels could have an impact at a range of anywhere between 40 and 400 years was one of the studies. So not exactly claiming that there's a catastrophe, but just looking into the issue and analyzing it. A number of people have latched onto this and claimed that Exxon knew about the, quote, risks of global warming, of climate change, and that they lied to the public about this, and that they duped people into buying gasoline, and that therefore we have to investigate them for fraud. That's what the essential argument is. Now let me tell you, as a lawyer and just an intelligent person, this theory is absolute nonsense. Okay, Exxon, even if it had lied, in my view, for 30 years about the temperature record, it still wouldn't be fraud. Fraud is a very specific cause of action that requires you to lie about something that matters in a transaction, typically to another person, that causes that person damages. And it can't be lying about something that they knew or should have known. It has to be the kind of thing that you can trick them essentially into making a purchase. It's not the same thing as just being a bad citizen. It's not the same thing as spouting stupid ideas. It's not the same thing even as lying. It's effectively theft by trickery, okay? And it's very much based on the idea that, and this comes out of the founding, out of the Enlightenment, and out of the whole idea of modern law, which is the purpose of law is to protect our individual rights, our rights as citizens. It's to protect us from criminals, essentially, protect us from theft, protect us from people attacking us and either taking our stuff or destroying our lives. Not the idea that the government's job is to protect society at large and essentially and ensure that it remains moral or that nobody ever lies about anything. That's not what fraud is all about. And I'm more than happy to elaborate on that, but again, let me repeat, what Exxon did could not possibly be fraud. I don't think there's any theory on which it could be fraud. And yet, what is the argument that the attorneys general are making? The argument essentially amounts to this. Exxon has committed a fraud on whom? Well, on the public, on shareholders, on everybody in general, but nobody in particular. There's no real theory that any individual human beings who are alive today have been damaged by what Exxon has done. I've seen no theory that's even coherently argues for damages to people now. Damages someday long in the future if all of our predictions turn out to be true and all of what other people who criticize global warming hysteria, all of their predictions turn out to be false. Okay, that's an argument, but that's a debate over what's going to happen to climate and the effects of fossil fuels. But that's not the same thing as arguing fraud. So essentially the argument here is it's a fraud on this kind of collective entity we call society. This is an example of collectivism infecting the law. This is the idea that the government's purpose or job is to protect everybody in general, but nobody in particular. It's to protect this mass called society. And government, you can trace this back to thinkers like Rousseau, like Marx, Hegel, others, many in modern times that I mentioned before, which is the essential idea here is that individuals aren't the object of government. Government's job is to protect the, quote, public in general. But not, and I don't mean that by saying to protect all of the individuals who make up the public. It just protects this kind of collective entity called the public, which of course is just a license for government either to assert the interests and rights of some people over others or to essentially just have an excuse to rule over people and treat them like, effectively like sheep. So that's, I think, again, this is this idea of collectivism creeping into the law, an area that I litigated for many years, campaign finance laws. This is the idea that we can't allow individuals to corrupt our democracy by spending money on speech that might convince the electorate to do something different than it would otherwise do. It's the same kind of idea. It's that the government's job is to protect this entity called the public, and that we aren't allowed to try to convince people or try to affect or influence people to do what they would freely do. That's yet another idea that is undermining the idea of freedom of speech. Because if you focus on groups, if the idea is that the government is in charge of this public interest or what the group thinks, and it gets to maintain that, then what any individual thinks as an individual doesn't really matter. They have absolutely no right to try to affect what the group thinks because their ideas and their views and their values are insignificant when weighed against the group. And it's government's job essentially to maintain the views or the rights of the collective. And I think there are many other examples of this. But since I'm running out of time, let me wrap up and conclude with a few positive points. So what's the antidote to all of this? Jim talked about the terrorist attacks, so if people want to ask me questions about the terrorist attacks and the kinds of ideas that we see coming out in those circumstances, I'm perfectly happy to talk about them as well. But I want to get to the Q&A as quickly as I can, but I think you see the same kinds of things in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attack, in the aftermath of the Garland, Texas attack. What we saw, instead of a steadfast, courageous defense of free speech and the right to offend others, what was it? It was hand-wringing and appeasement. Don't offend other people's religion. Don't offend Islam. Essentially sacrifice Western ideas for the sake of, angry people in the Middle East. I think we saw that throughout the Western world. So what's the antidote to this? Now, I said earlier that in order to combat bad ideas, we need better ideas in their place. And as I mentioned, I think the key ideas we need to focus on when it comes to free speech are reason, the pursuit of happiness, and individualism, right? So let me just say a word about what I think is the right way to defend free speech. There are many arguments in favor of free speech. It leads to an orderly society. It's the path to knowledge. It's a way to maintain and prevent chaos, persuasion over force. They're all true, and they're all important components of the right to free speech. But I think there's a more fundamental way to look at it. And the fundamental way to look at it is from the individual standpoint. Free speech is not just essential to maintaining a free society. It's absolutely essential to the lives of every man, woman, and child in any society, right? It is absolutely essential to your ability to live a good life. Freedom of speech and freedom of thought are connected, right? So in order for us to function in life, we not only have to think, we have to use our minds, we have to solve problems, but we also have to communicate with others. Free speech is an expression of our individuality. It's an expression of who we are and what we think. It's a necessary means towards solving the problems that we need to solve in order to live the good life. And reason, thinking, can't be forced. We can't be compelled to believe what others want us to believe. Any effort to try to compel us to accept ideas that we object to will end up in destruction in one way or another. Even believing ideas that are true. I can't be forced to believe an idea that is true. I can be thrown in prison. I can be dominated. My life can be snuffed out. But I can't be made to believe things that I don't agree with. The only way to get me to believe something is by persuading me to do that. That's where free speech comes in. It is the expression of the way our minds function and the way we have to function as individual human beings put into the form of a right and ultimately the form of a legal protection for that right. It ultimately says you have the right to come to your own conclusions and guide your own life, and nobody has the right to force you or attempt to force you to believe what they believe. If they want to engage with you, they have to engage with you on the basis of reason and persuasion and not force. That, I think, is the fundamental reason that we have to protect free speech. If we want to protect our lives and the ability to live a good life, we absolutely have to protect freedom of speech. So that's a moral argument in favor of free speech, not just a legal or what I would call a consequentialist argument. Although free speech is beneficial for many, many things, it's fundamentally beneficial to each of our ability to live our lives as sovereign, free individuals. Let me stop there and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Excellent. So please raise your hand and somebody with a microphone will come to you. When it's your time to ask your question, please identify yourself so Steve knows to whom he is speaking. And if you're watching online, either on YouTube or Facebook, leave your questions in the chat room or in the comments at Facebook, and I will read them to the group. We're going to start over here.
I'll end all your comments or questions with a question mark. Okay, question mark.
Raise my voice. So you mentioned something that Bret Stephens wrote about in the Wall Street yesterday about a loss of confidence in Western civilization, and therefore we're infected by these bad ideas which are gaining traction, especially in colleges.
Yeah.
So the question is, having seen complete appeasement of violence against free speech, is it against the law to suppress free speech? Is it against, and if it is against the law, can and you talked about a question of harm in the Exxon case, can people claim harm and therefore sue the California college system and its chancellor?
That's a great question. So let me try to answer that last question quickly, and I'll answer it by saying I'm not entirely sure whether they can sue the California school system. Although I think they probably can, but I'd have to go into a lot of technical legal issues for why they would be able to. So the short answer is, though, yes, there are all kinds of laws that protect our rights and allow us to sue against those, especially government actors. In fact, almost exclusively government actors for violating those rights. And it's certainly, I would say, probably the case that people who suffered damages, let's say, or the college Republicans, or even possibly Yiannopoulos could sue the school system. But let me give you a broader answer to that question, which is, the short answer is yes, if your rights are violated, it's the role of government and the role of criminal and tort law to give you a remedy for that, right? But we have to be very clear about what constitutes a violation of your rights and what doesn't constitute a violation of your rights. Free speech, generally speaking, as a right is something that typically the government is going to violate because it's in the nature of what government can do. It can outlaw your ability to speak, whereas a private party can attack you, right? But that's not as the fundamental, the violation typically is going to be to your person or your property, although you could characterize it. So if you're giving a talk, or one of you now rushes up and attacks me and starts to beat me with a coffee cup or something, that's typically the law wouldn't call that a violation of my right to free speech. It would just call that a violation of my personal integrity and my right to liberty and my bodily integrity. So it would be a crime, right? It would be battery. But if it's done to shut me up, you can think of that in a sense as a violation of my right to free speech, but it's fundamentally a violation of my personhood or my bodily integrity and my right to be left alone. Government, of course, can violate people's right to free speech, and the reason we have a First Amendment and a whole system of laws that back that up and give causes of action to people is to prevent governments from doing that. California school system as a state school certainly can violate the right to free speech, and the Supreme Court has said, in essence, that people have the right to speak in public places on public universities, not on a private university. But we do have to make a distinction between a violation of the right to free speech, which really government typically does by preventing you from speaking, and just an exercise of one's own property rights. So let me take the example of Heartland. It's a private organization, a private institution. If Heartland says, Simpson, we don't want you to come speak here, that's not a violation of my rights. If in the middle of my talk, Jim came up and said, I think this actually stinks, we didn't think it was a good talk, get the hell out of here, that's not a violation of my right to free speech. They have every right to associate with me or not associate with me. It's when somebody uses force against you, or if government acts against you in a way that prevents you from speaking, those are both violations of your rights, although it depends on the context which right that would be. Well, it depends on, it's definitely the case that that colleges and that, government in general does not do what it should do to protect our rights to free speech. There's no question about that. The best example I can think of are terrorist attacks. We don't go after terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the way we should when they, think of the Salman Rushdie fatwa, right? The Ayatollah Khomeini issues a fatwa against Salman Rushdie. He's still, basically living under constant security. Bookstores in the United States are bombed. Our government does nothing. It really does nothing. Not only does it do nothing, it ends up essentially apologizing to the Islamists who attack either Rushdie or those who draw cartoons of Muhammad. So that sort of appeasement is the exact opposite of what our government needs to be doing. And yeah, I agree with that totally. It's not doing its job. But that's not for lack of ability. The laws are on the books. It's not hard to know how to deal with terrorists. We're not dealing with it the right way. And I think, to circle back to the theme of my talk, I think it's because of these ideas. We are not willing to stand up for Western values. We're not willing to stand up for freedom. We're not willing to stand up for freedom of speech. And that's really this is why this is an intellectual fight. It's not an issue of the mechanics of how government operates. They have the tools. They don't have the will.
I have a simple question, and I think you answered it very quickly. So let me ask it again, and you can expand on it. Do individuals and businesses have the right not to associate?
Absolutely, yes. Now, there's a caveat to that. So, morally, and it used to be legally, the answer was absolutely yes. Today, legally, the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. We have violated this principle of the right of association. Anti-discrimination laws, although in many ways understandable in the context in which they were passed, are gross violations of the right of association. Businesses should have the right even to do really stupid things and not hire and not associate with people that they don't want to. Now, that's a big subject and a big topic, much bigger than I could cover now. And there are all kinds of issues that complicate this in the history of race relations, let's say, in this country. But we're seeing the consequences of that today. I think actually racism and tribalism are on the increase in large part because we're trying to force people to deal with and associate with those that they don't want to deal with and associate with. The big issue these days on that front is probably gay rights, and you've heard about the issue of people not wanting to bake wedding cakes for those for gay marriages and the like. And my answer is, look, if I were a wedding cake baker, I would do it and not have a problem with it at all. I might criticize harshly the people who don't, but they have every right to do that. That's what it means to be free. It means you have the freedom to guide your own life, associate with whom you wish, and not associate with whomever you wish. And when we try to force people to associate with one another, we achieve precisely the opposite of what everybody claims we're trying to achieve, which is social harmony. Do we have more social harmony today after these, on the heels of these laws being passed, or less? I would answer less. We have more tribalism. We have more groupism. We have more racism today than I think we did in earlier times. And a large part of the reason is we think we can force people to associate with one another. It's a really horrible thing to do, even if it makes sense for people to associate. Even if they should associate, when you force them together, you throw all reason and good sense out the window, and now you put people in a situation in which they are naturally opposed to one another. Even if they weren't before, if you force people to deal with each other, now they're going to be opposed to one another. And that, I think, that creates the kind of disharmony that everybody claims it solves. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Art Ellingson. I run the Tea Party here in Arlington Heights. And I want to know if we can sue Al Gore for the fraud he has committed in making the government spend all this money on this thing they call global warming, which actually, there's two names for carbon dioxide in the air. One is pollution from some people's point of view, and other people just call it plant food.
Yeah, or breath, right? So it's funny, as a lawyer, everybody always wants to know who they can sue and who they can't sue. I mean, the short answer is this. So as a serious answer to the question, I think the answer would be no, you couldn't sue Al Gore for any kind of a conspiracy. You might be able to sue him for libel or defamation. It's hard to know. I'd have to look at, see what he said. But what should happen, now keep in mind the only way, that Al Gore can do what he's doing and his compatriots or the people that he's dealing with, the only way they can get away with harming others, or the only way they really matter, is when they're in league with government, right? So it's not a mistake that he teamed up with Eric Schneiderman in New York and Maura Healey in Massachusetts to go after Exxon. They have to have actors in government. If we really want to stop this kind of thing, not only do we need to make the right arguments, but we have to go after those government officials and say, this is not the proper role for government. You must stop this. Now, Exxon has brought a countersuit against them, to my knowledge. I'm not really familiar with it, but I think it's a civil rights suit that is designed to essentially repel the investigation. I think they're arguing that this is a conspiracy to violate Exxon and other parties' right to free speech. But that wouldn't be against Al Gore. That would be against the attorneys general. That is a viable suit, by the way.
But $500 million for Solyndra, if that's not a tort, if that's not a huge problem, the $500 million from Solyndra, I don't know what is.
Well, but is that Al Gore's? I mean, look, I'm against. I think it's horrible, but that's and maybe there's a way you could sue over that, but.
Al Gore, sue Barack Obama.
Well, you'd sue the administration. You'd have to sue the government. it wouldn't be against. You got to vote different politicians in office, but when, yeah, I know.
All right, back here in the back of the room, please identify yourself.
Hey there, Steve. My name is James. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right here.
Oh, there you go.
Hi. So can you talked a little bit about like Exxon. Obviously, there's a lot of people claiming things about corporations. There's a lot of people talking about climate change and global warming. Can you talk a little bit about the logical principle of the onus of proof and how that plays into people like making arbitrary claims and the importance of that in these types of conversations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, too. So, I mean, there's so much wrong with the Exxon investigations and the legal theories behind them. I could write, and I've thought about writing an entire article, long article, just running through all of it. So one of them, as you pointed out, is the idea that, I mean, it's even hard to state this in terms of the onus of proof, right? So the onus of proof is on him who asserts the positive, meaning that if you file a lawsuit against somebody or you're the defendant in a criminal case and the government is proceeding against you, they've got to meet a certain standard of proof even to get through the courtroom door, right? Now, the rules of procedure have become really watered down over time, so it's way too easy to sue these days. But even when you think about what the argument is that they're making, the argument is essentially, it's not Exxon knew about the catastrophe that is global warming, because that's just not true, right? There is no catastrophe. I mean, I was just outside, and there's no environmental catastrophe going on out there. I mean, I'm being flip about that, but it's really, you know, it's a goofy claim. But that's not even the claim. The claim is Exxon knew about the possible risk of global warming at some point in the future. Well, that's awesome. So does 100% of all of the other human beings on Earth, right? And not to mention the people that drive cars that run on gasoline made by Exxon. So where's the argument here? I mean, you want to know about the state of the debate about climate change, just open a newspaper. Everybody who buys gas from Exxon, everybody who owns stock in Exxon, they can spend 5 minutes on the internet and know as much as any other human being practically on the planet about this issue. And they can make their own judgment about whether they want to buy gas and drive to work or ride their bikes to work, right? So, I mean, the idea that there's nothing to prove, there would be nothing, you know, it's hard to even talk about the onus of proof because the statement of the issue isn't even subject to proof in any way whatsoever. It's just there might be a risk of doing this. Well, join the crowd. I mean, there might be a risk of doing all kinds of things, and human beings have known that since the beginning of time. That's not an argument that should be able to get you in court. That's just a debate. So, but it's a really good point to focus on.
We're going to go right here, but if you have another question, please put your hand up now so Veronica can come to you.
Let me apologize for asking you a general Ayn Rand question, not a free speech question. What I find interesting about Ayn Rand is she talks, you get these sermons about selfishness and self-interest, but all of her heroes in her books are always acting in an altruistic way. How do you interpret that? Is there a message there different from the overt message, or is she not? I assume enough people here have read some of Ayn Rand's books to maybe not only know that, but have noticed that too. How do you interpret that? The Dagny Taggart, you know, busted her butt to keep the railroad running, apparently for no other reason that the country needs the railroad.
Well, first of all, it's Ayn Rand, not Ayn Rand, but that's a comment. It's okay. I interpret that as two things. One, they aren't sacrificing themselves, or they are at times, and then they realize their mistake and they change course. Notice, I mean, keep in mind that Dagny leaves Taggart Transcontinental. I don't want to get too deep into the novels because there may be people who haven't read them, but Dagny and Hank Rearden are two characters that illustrate exactly what's wrong with altruism. They do, in a real sense, act out of altruistic, you know, out of a sort of duty or self-sacrificial premise. When they're convinced that that's the way they're acting, they change course and they go on strike and society implodes. But that's the shortest answer I can give you that's actually substantive. We could talk about it afterwards, though. It's a good question.
My name is Dan Schustek. Now, I know that if I was to stand up, yell, fire, fire, that would be illegal, right? That's not free speech. Well, can a lawsuit be brought against Madonna for saying she wants to blow up the White House? Is that free speech?
In the context, I think, I didn't see, I don't know if there's a video of this or not, but let me just talk about the general issue, right? So you're not allowed to yell fire. I mean, actually, you could yell fire right now. Having just said it, if I fire, like nothing happened, right? And everybody knows it's a joke, right? So that's a hypothetical example that Oliver Wendell Holmes used in an early free speech case to indicate that the way he would have put it is there are exceptions or limits to this right, and that's a sensible way to think about it in terms of limits. But the proper way to think about it is, or to say it is, falsely yell fire in a crowded movie house. In other words, to translate it, it's incite people or cause people or defraud people into doing something that will cause them harm. Right? I look at that more as an example of fraud. It's a mass fraud on the entire audience in the movie theater. And it's predictable. If your intention is to cause a riot, which will then damage the theater and harm people, you can be prosecuted for that. If Madonna's real intention was to incite people to go blow up the White House, and she wasn't just kidding, I suspect she was kidding, and I think under the circumstances, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not defending her. I really don't. I didn't hear the comment or see the video, but the bottom line is this. If you seriously are trying to cause other people to essentially join you in a criminal conspiracy, that's the one way to think of incitement. Let's all go attack Jim and beat him because, look, he's on his cell phone, he's not paying attention. I think that's horrible. Join me in grabbing the microphone and bashing him over the head, and I'm really serious about that. And it's in circumstances in which people are really angry at Jim, and we are actually going to attack him. That could be incitement, right? But joking about it, it's not. It's obviously not. So that's really the line is it has to be, I mean, under what the Supreme Court has said, is it has to be a threat of imminent harm in circumstances in which harm is actually likely. Now, there are reasons to question that to some degree, but the bottom line way to think about it is this. If you're intentionally trying to cause people or have people join you in a conspiracy to kill the president, to attack and burn down the White House, or just to attack your neighbor, that's a violation of law. But that ultimately involves a criminal plan to use force against another person. I think the best way to think about this is if it's an effort to violate another person's rights, by which I mean use force against that person, that can be a violation of their rights and no longer free speech. That's the proper distinction. You could think about it as between speech and action. I like to think about it legally as between speech and an effort to initiate or use force against other people. But it's a really good question.
Well, since you pulled me into this, and thanks for that. I have
Turnabout
a
is
question,
fair play.
Free speech, they say, well, free speech has consequences. Like you can say whatever you like, but society or your employer or somebody, there may be consequences for that. You look at today, especially in social media today, Twitter for instance, you could tweet something after a couple beers from hanging out at the Heartland Institute and then go to bed. And if somebody's offended by that, or if the right person or wrong person is offended by that, a Twitter storm could erupt. And you could wake up the next morning to a text on your phone with your boss saying you're fired. And you don't even know what this is all about because all this happened very instantaneously around the world. And this has happened to people. There's a hashtag, has Justine landed yet? And it was about a woman young woman who made a joke she made a joke about AIDS on her way to Africa. Okay, maybe it was distasteful. But she was fired literally before her plane landed. Now these things happen in society today. And cheating a little bit because we talked about a little bit of this on our podcast today. But, before social media, or maybe 20 years ago, I think society had more respect for free speech in that just because somebody said something that you were offended by, it didn't mean that person had to lose their livelihood, lose any respect in society. You could just disagree with them and say, that cake shop owner doesn't agree with me on a certain issue, but gosh, they make nice cakes. Today, oh my God, that cake baker or that baker doesn't agree with me on a certain issue. Let's shut them down. Let's run them out of business. I mean, this is insane. Now, I just want you to kind of comment on that. I mean, what happened to our society that this is where we're at now, that there isn't a cultural respect for free speech and where you tolerate what somebody else says, even if it's distasteful, because it is frankly un-American and it's against our principles of freedom to ostracize and try to ruin someone's life just because they say something publicly to which you don't agree.
Yeah, I think that goes way beyond free speech and is about, there's many issues wrapped up in this, not the least of which is just, is a lot of very bad ideas that cause people to be hypersensitive about all kinds of things that they shouldn't be hypersensitive about. I mentioned earlier that I did a couple panel talks with Fleming Rose, and he was asked a similar question. He said, not only do I think we shouldn't have sensitivity training, I think we all need insensitivity training, which I thought that's a really, you know, I mean, people are taught to, there's a kind of rampant emotionalism in this culture these days, and I think people are, especially kids, are taught to treat any kind of slight or any kind of offensive anything as a sort of attack on them. They're so sensitive to everything these days, and there are lots of reasons for that. It's really hard to get into all of them. But I do think there's an important element of this goes to the idea of if we respect each other as reasonable individuals who are independent-minded people who are capable of being persuaded of things, right? We look out at a world of reasoning individuals, and we have reason to think, yeah, these are basically reasonable people. I can reach them through persuasion. There's much less reason to get, you know, outraged and horrified every time somebody says something, even an off-color remark, even something that is actually offensive. And I think part of the reason that that's driven is this idea that people are just mindless creatures. They're just a sort of herd, they're like herd animals, and anytime somebody says something wrong, they're all just going to jump in behind and follow the herd. And I think this relates back to a point I made, which, I mean, this is a really broad issue, vastly oversimplified, but we need to have more respect for individual thinking minds, for reason, for the idea of persuasion and working out our differences, and that does very much dovetail with the issue of free speech. But the question you ask is really vast, so.
Well, you're
that's
at
the best I can
you're
do.
at the Ayn Rand Institute, so fix that.
All right.
Get work on that.
We'll get on it.
All right.
I'm Nancy Thorner, and I've been concerned about this for a long time. We all know about the annex of George Soros. Now, it's not exactly freedom of speech, but he's using his money for freedom of speech by hiring all these thugs and armies of people who are going around and getting paid very well to disrupt campuses and town hall meetings. And to me, this is treason, and this is undermining the government, and why can't anything be done about him? Because he's trying to destroy the Trump administration.
So a couple points on that. I mean, I don't know exactly what he's doing. Let me put it this way. If anybody is paying people to go attack other people, that's a crime. But attack meaning to go either violate their property rights or use force in some way against them, bludgeon them, let's say, okay? I have to say I'm highly skeptical that that's what George Soros is doing. I don't think he's doing that. And I also want to remind you of something. So as a campaign finance attorney, I used to get the argument from people on the left constantly. The Koch brothers are paying people to go yell at our poor politicians in town hall meetings. Then the topic was, anybody remember? It was Obamacare, okay? What did everybody call that? This is not real grassroots political activity. A Tea Party was called AstroTurf lobbying and a Koch, essentially a Koch ginned up problem if it did get a dime from them. Go attack other people. But if a politician is holding a town hall meeting, that's a public event, I think people have every right to get as many of their supporters in there to go yell at politicians as they can, whether the left is doing it to the right or the right is doing it to the left. That's an example of political participation and free speech in action. Now, they don't have the right to attack. If you're going to, before you criticize what Soros is allegedly doing, remember that the shoe is just as easily put on the other foot, and that's exactly what people called the Tea Parties and any organization that opposed what Obama wanted to do. So I am highly skeptical that Soros is committing treason or that he is paying people to engage in a criminal conspiracy. I don't really buy it. It's possible.
It's been proven that he is, and he wants to undermine, he hates
Oh, yeah, there's no question about that.
And he has these clubs to go out and do what they're doing. This is their whole purpose.
I'm skeptical of that.
Friday night before the March primary, George Soros' people going through Jan Schakowsky's husband. Jan Schakowsky's the local congresswoman around here. Hired people to.
Then that's an easy case. Yes. Paying people to riot is a violation of law. But I don't think that about, and I've gotten exact against people that I suspect would support, and being principled about use their free speech kind of protest.
One of the real protests without
violence against a particular group, that's tantamount to the university stamping out that group's speech, and that should be considered as much a violation of free speech or of the rights of the individuals as the university doing it itself. So, but I think the best you can do.
Time for a few more questions right over here.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned about younger kids being more sensitive, like how everyone was being more sensitive about social standings and such. Mm-hmm. Now, I gotta disagree with you there. And I'm in high school, and now the curses I hear every day, I hear the F-bomb, I hear the B-bomb, I hear the A-bomb, and lots of bombs, yes. And I sometimes curse, yes, I'll admit this. And one of my teachers doesn't really appreciate that and makes me go get a detention every time I curse. Mm-hmm. And now we have in English, this is my English teacher, and currently we are on the topic of free speech. Now, I'm not going to state the obvious because, well, it's obvious. I got the detention for talking about how the two types of Islamic religion were constantly at war with each other, and I mentioned that writing about it in history is a pain in the ass. Mm-hmm. My exact words. And she told me to go get a detention. Now, I threw her a dirty look, and then I smirked at one of my friends because it's like, and I told you so, smirk. And now I wanted to mention that it wasn't really sensitivity right there, and I wanted to ask you how would I deal with that kind of blocking of free speech?
So first, a couple points. You remind me of my daughter, who's also in high school and also likes to swear in class, and I don't know where she gets it from, frankly, but I'm kidding about that. But I think so. A couple points. One is, in general, I think high school students, in my observation, are hardier and just less sensitive than college kids are in many ways, and I think able to deal with a range of ideas that college students aren't. I think college is where people really start getting ruined, although I could be wrong about that. This is based on a very small sample size, but I don't think I'm wrong about it. But so that's one point, is that I think high school kids are a bit different. Secondly, if you really want to make an issue of free speech, I mean, there's inherent difficulties in the fact that you're in school. Schools have to be administered and run in a particular way. They just can't allow every student to speak constantly. It's not a violation of a student's free speech that they're not allowed to speak out in class and say anything they want. It just can't be. And this is part of, like, I'm a real radical. I'm against public education entirely. And one of the reasons for this is the minute you start forcing people to finance and send people's kids to school and pay for it, you create a clash of ideas, and you essentially require people to fund the ideas of other people, and that can never work. That's a recipe for disaster. But we're long down that road, and so what the courts have said ultimately is you have a right to some speech in school, but you can't just take over the classroom and say anything you want. What I would urge you to do, if you really want to mount an issue and take on this as a free speech issue, is so I'll be blunt, can the profanity and talk about ideas. And when they give you detention because you're talking about ideas intelligently, then you'll know they're opposed to your ideas and not opposed to your profanity. And that's not by way of shaking my finger at you. I swear a whole lot. But this is what I tell. Act like it's an issue of principle. Don't give them an excuse to give you detention for silly reasons. Force them to give you detention because you're articulate and intelligent and making good arguments. That's how you make headway. Make the best arguments.
Former Soviet Union. And a very small part of this was financed by George with narcotics financing and using a lot for him to involve his narcotics distribution through other people.
It's not the issue. Whether it's on the right, you can teach people really bad ideas that will put them in a position where they're not able to deal with life. So that's one group, the ones who are true believers and they really think they're being threatened. On the other, power. And they grow up to be, politicians. They grow up to be really bad politicians. They grow up to be the dictatorial types that we see in politics here and abroad. And there are people like that in the world. Among the press, I have to say, I should give you a trigger warning here that I'm going to criticize Trump, but I think Trump's attacks, notwithstanding how bad the press really is oftentimes. I mean, look, the election of Trump is of the century and they missed it totally. What the hell was going on? They just sit, inside the Beltway or wherever and they do Google searches and they write a very problematic to hear a president and a lot of people attacking the entire